So welcome to another episode. So today we have Simon Ruffell on, who is a psychiatrist, psychedelics researcher, lecturer, and also a trainee shaman. So welcome to today's episode, Simon.
Thanks, Stephen. Good to be here.
I tell you what, this topic is so interesting, and it's definitely something that has come from the sort of taboo subject to mainstream of late, whether that's down to the geist of the current world, whether it's the podcasting side, whether it's people's experience. I'm not sure exactly, but it's definitely something that is a hot topic at the moment. So what do people not understand about psychedelics that you think that they should?
That's a super good question. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think there's been a bit of a pendulum swing. So in the Western world, people started getting interested in psychedelics in around the 1950s, a little bit before. And we're talking kind of academics and scientists here. There's a really long indigenous tradition, both in the UK and the Western world and all across the world, that far predates this. But in terms of Western scientific interest in psychedelics, that kind of started increasing around the 1950s, and then psychedelics were banned, kind of moving into the 70s and the 80s. And what we're seeing over the last kind of 10, 20 years is this, the so-called psychedelic renaissance. And I think that people can go either one of two ways with psychedelics. They can either assume that they are incredibly dangerous. We need to be extremely cautious surrounding their use, which is true. We do need to be cautious, but a lot of the dangers that people associate with psychedelics are actually unfounded, and there's some interesting kind of political reasons as to why those dangers were emphasized. So people can go in and fall into that camp, which is psychedelics are dangerous. You need to be extremely careful, and it's unethical to do research into psychedelics at the moment. But there's also another camp that people have started falling into more recently, which is psychedelics are amazing. They're going to cure everything. They're this panacea. We just need to get them to as many people as we can as possible. Now, both of these ways of thinking are problematic and aren't particularly helpful. So I think that's kind of where I sit, trying to give more of a balanced idea about the use of psychedelics, what they're good for, and also where we need to be a bit more cautious.
So is it kind of like Aristotle's view of not being at either end of the spectrum, maybe somewhere in the middle with a more pragmatic and nuanced approach to what's safe, what's not safe, what's the benefits and uses for specific individuals, and maybe who should not be looking to engage in psychedelic experiences?
Yeah, for sure. So, for example, there's growing evidence. There's a lot of evidence now that suggests that psychedelics can be really beneficial for people with mental health conditions, with particular mental health conditions. So, for example, neurotic mental health conditions. And in general, you can split most mental health conditions either into psychotic or neurotic conditions. Neurosis being things like anxiety-based conditions. Psychosis being where you have a bit of a detachment from reality. And this, again, is from a very Western point of view. And there are other ways of understanding these things, which I'm sure we'll come on to in indigenous knowledge systems. And in general, psychedelics seem to be showing a lot of promise for neurotic conditions. So things like anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, all of these things, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that could be good. For people who suffer from psychotic conditions, so these are things more like schizophrenia, emotionally unstable personality disorder, and some other personality disorders, bipolar disorder, psychedelics do carry more of a risk, and they can be destabilizing for people with those conditions. But again, caveat there are, and I've seen people be treated quite successfully who would have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, things like that, in the Amazon rainforest using not just psychedelics, there's usually other plants as well, but it's not quite as simplistic as saying those people with psychosis shouldn't be taking psychedelics. But we do need to be particularly cautious with those people.
So do you think there's a case of tarring all psychedelics with the same brush, or do you think that certain versions of psychedelics, let's say, have more potency and therefore maybe ayahuasca is not a good thing, and psilocybin mushrooms are, or vice versa? Do you think that's a case of that as well, or do you think it's just a case of, yeah, maybe if you have got psychotic history, then maybe be quite cautious when taking these things? And if so, why do you think that is? Why do you think it has that effect on people on that side versus the sort of neurotic side, or vice versa?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. So, psychedelics can break down your perception of the world. They can break down your ego structure, and you get this thing quite often with psychedelics and called ego dissolution, which is when your sense of self can dissolve, and you can experience the world. It's quite hard to describe if you haven't experienced it, but there's a lack of separation between you and everyone else and everything else in the world. And so when people have these mystical or peak-like experiences, they quite often describe these things. They quite often describe, feeling at one with nature, feeling at one with other people, feeling, at one with God, that God is nature, all of these kinds of things. And if you suffer from a mental health condition that might give you more of a fragile sense of self, some personality disorders, like emotionally unstable personality disorder, can mean that you have, a more unstable sense of self. Then if you completely break down your ego structure, it can be destabilizing for those people. And that's one theory of how psychedelics might worsen psychotic-like conditions.
It's interesting you say that, because a lot of people, like I've got friends who have taken, psilocybin mushrooms and things like that, and they all kind of have. It's weird because a lot of the time with drugs, for example, they're quite personal. Like someone on alcohol might be super happy all the time, some might get angry, but it seems that with psychedelics there seems to be a base level of experience, whether that's DMT or mushrooms, and they all mention this sort of ego death or disillusion, as you mentioned. Is that part of the appeal of it, that it can help to, if you are on the anxious side, as you said, are on the depressive side, it helps to bring you back to a blank slate, if that makes sense, to start again? Because we are trauma absorbing animals, aren't we? All of the trauma that we have had over our lives is stuck somewhere, and maybe the psychedelic experience of ego death resets you back to base level. It's like having a service on the car, possibly.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, this kind of like computer reset or kind of defragmenting a computer, that was kind of, these are phrases that were used a lot kind of 10 years ago when psychedelic research was still re-emerging. And I mean, I guess there is a bit of truth in that it can do that to a certain degree, but I think that it's an oversimplistic way of understanding how psychedelics work. And there are many different ways of understanding that, but perhaps the most compelling model at the moment from a Western scientific point of view is that psychedelics can change the models that we have, that we use to experience the world. So our brain is an expert predictive program mechanism. We predict what's going to happen in the world, and we have these models that we've developed that allow us to do that. And sometimes these can be very helpful, but sometimes these can also not serve us. They can be dysfunctional. So, for example, if you have experienced trauma early on in your life, say that you're bitten by a dog or something like that, and you're then terrified of dogs growing up throughout your whole life, and you have this assumption, you have this prior belief that dogs are dangerous because this dog bit you. And then if you take psychedelics, you might be able to change that prior belief, the thing that you use to predict your experience. And you can think differently. You can change the way that you're thinking about this experience. And you might come to a realization when you're thinking more objectively in the psychedelic experience that actually this dog was most likely traumatized. They've been beaten and they've been kicked. And you now realize that. And this dog was terrified. And that's why that dog bit you, is because it was a terrified dog and it thought that it was at risk from you. And you've now managed to change your prior. And you can do that because when you are on psychedelics, your brain is in a more neuroplastic state, which literally means it's more like putty. It's easier to form new neuronal connections. So it's going back to a state that's more similar to the state that we're in when we're a child, when it's much easier to like learn a language or to, learn how to walk, learn an instrument, all of these kinds of things. And so that's probably one of the most compelling models that we have as to how psychedelics work at the moment.
Is that the case, do you think, for every single psychedelic? Is there that base level across the board, whether it is, as I said, DMT, ayahuasca, LSD, mushrooms, or is there different nuanced positions within each of those?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a thing that we should point out to begin with is that we can group psychedelics into different classes as well. So we have all of the other kind of common psychedelics, which we call the typical psychedelics, and these all work in a similar kind of way. So, for example, we have LSD, psilocybin, which is the active component in magic mushrooms, DMT, which is also found in ayahuasca, and all of these psychedelics, they're the typical psychedelics. And then we have another group, which is the atypical psychedelics. And these psychedelics still have psychedelic properties, but they work in a slightly different way. And so here we have iboga, which is a root found in Western Gabon. It contains many different compounds. One of the most famous active compounds in iboga is ibogaine. And then ketamine as well also falls into that atypical group of psychedelics. And the typical psychedelics seem to work in a similar kind of way, but the atypical psychedelics, their pharmacology is described as being, slightly messier. People say it's a messier pharmacology. So there can be different ways that those work as well. But again, all of this is just one way of understanding psychedelics, which is the Western scientific way. But there are other ways of understanding how they work too. So, for example, in indigenous cultures all around the world, they've been using psychedelics for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they don't disagree with what we're talking about, neuroplasticity and various other mechanisms such as, disrupting activity within the default mode network, which is part of the brain that's linked to your sense of self. Most psychedelics are going to be acting on serotonin receptors. They're going to be serotonin agonists, which actually is the same way that many antidepressants work. And they don't disagree with that. They don't say, yeah, that's not how they're working. But they have a very different viewpoint on how they work. They believe that psychedelics open up your consciousness so that you can have contact with things that we don't usually have contact with in our waking consciousness. For example, spirits and energy and things like that. And they say that it's through communicating with those spirits that's how psychedelics are working. And what I'm really interested in is how can these two areas of understanding psychedelics, the Western scientific and the indigenous knowledge systems, how can they work together? Are they saying similar things? Are they saying different things? How can we respectfully engage in conversation between those two worlds?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I'm writing a book at the minute. So I've written 5 books, 3 self-help, 2 novels, basically short novellas. Let's call them. And
Nice.
my next one is a basically philosophical based book. And one of the questions in there is about the simulation theory. Are we living in a simulation? Now, whether or not we are or not, one of the key components of the answer is, what do psychedelics form part of this, as you said, consciousness side, where it can get you back out of the current remit that you're involved in within, whether it's a simulation or it's the world or the universe, whatever it is. And that experience allows you to see things from a visual standpoint and experience things from an ego, an internal standpoint that you would not otherwise have experienced. So people talk about the experience of seeing, objects moving or sort of breathing, as it were, that maybe because we have the visible light of 0.005% of everything in existence, maybe this points the nodule up from that exact percentage up a couple of percent, which then allows you to see and feel these things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And maybe then, as you said, you are experiencing the consciousness in a more intense way than you would normally, which is why you said people say, oh, I'm increasing consciousness, or I come away from it feeling like it's a spiritual experience, or I had the ego death. Maybe it's all part of that same parameter of thinking potentially.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, I mean, it definitely could be. I mean, what are your views on this with simulation theory? Do you think that psychedelics can be a window into that?
So I think this is quite a long conversation, so I'm not going to go all the way into it, but I think simulation theory and the creation theory have a lot of similarities rather. If you think
Mm.
of quantum physics with, the particle slits experiment, if you know much about that,
Yeah, yeah.
delayed choice experiment, etc., it shows that even at the small level, these protons or atoms, whatever, have consciousness because they are able to, depending on how they're observed, change the states that they're in. So
Hmm.
that argument can be used for both sides, whether it's simulation or not. This even happens throughout the universe where I don't know if you've seen Schrodinger's box, for example,
Yeah.
where the cat's alive and dead. All these sorts of things point to like the fact that imagine a computer game is
Hmm.
unrendered until you see, like, imagine you're on Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto, for example. It doesn't need to load all of the map until you get there, and that's the argument for simulation theory, is that these are rendering, even electrons. I think they can be one of two ways, and unless you check, it can be both ways at the same time. So
Hmm.
that's essentially what simulation theory is getting at, is that we live in a simulation. Now, where the psychedelics come in is to say you then can not necessarily see beyond that, but you have an appreciation for the fact that you're seeing it from a different angle. I don't think that necessarily taking them is going to mean that you now feel that you're, you know, character one in a game. I don't mean that. I just mean that it gives you a different perception of reality itself, because
Hmm.
ultimately, psychedelics are a visual as well as a feeling experience, and that visual experience can probably have quite a significant impact on your perspective. Like if I give you rose tinted glasses, and you always had them, or you always thought. I don't know if you've seen these videos. Actually, that's probably a better example where people are born colorblind and then you get given glasses that allow them to see. They all start crying immediately
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's such a massive, overwhelming experience that's completely changed their perspective on things forever, that it causes that overwhelming emotion. And I think that maybe psychedelics has that sort of property, which, as you said, if people are anxious or depressed or etc etc etc, it can have that uplifting effect where if people do have, maybe as you say, severe issues with maybe more serious, I'm not saying these other things aren't serious, by the way, but more serious issues with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, etc. Maybe that their brain isn't in a good place anyway. When you add this additional powerful, because ultimately they are kind of live things, aren't they? Like a mushroom is alive, and you add that to the mix, it could probably go as wrong as it could go right, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And there's some interesting stuff I want to pick up on in there as well. So you said, with the kind of the double slit experiment, it's suggesting that atoms have their own consciousness. And this ties into indigenous knowledge systems as well, because indigenous knowledge systems. So I run a research organization called Onaya Science, Onaya, which is based in the Peruvian Amazon. We conduct research into ayahuasca, which is a traditional plant medicine from the Amazon. And we do it all with curanderos, who are indigenous shamans deep in the Peruvian Amazon. And I've been doing that for the last 11 years. And 7 years ago, I started training with the Shipibo, which is the indigenous tribe that I work with, in shamanism myself. So I'm a psychiatrist and a shaman. And one thing that you just said, in relation to people suddenly putting these glasses on and then they see the world in this whole different way and there's no going back. That totally happened to me. You get in the Amazon rainforest with ayahuasca, but it wasn't just from drinking ayahuasca. I've been drinking ayahuasca, for 4 years, going back and forwards to the jungle before I started training in shamanism. But when I started my apprenticeship, when I started training, one of the changes in my, rose-tinted spectacles that you were just saying, was a change in worldview, was to start understanding the world in terms of animism. And animism is this concept that everything has consciousness, absolutely everything. And when you start thinking about the world like that, plants, for example, the ayahuasca vine, psychedelics like the psychedelic mushroom, they're no longer just these dead objects, or with plants, they're not, these non-conscious objects. They become these alive teachers that you can communicate with, not in the same way that we're communicating here. And that is the basis of shamanism, that you can communicate with these things that you wouldn't necessarily assume to be sentient. And so for me, going back and forward to the jungle, there was this moment where I was suddenly given these glasses that you just described, and there was plenty of tears, and also this feeling of, wow, there's no going back now. I can't change my perception of reality back to what it was again when I was just a mainstream psychiatrist.
It's crazy because every single experience, like our conversation today, we will come away different people. Even if it's a very small, minuscule adjustment, you're a different person. Tomorrow when you wake up, you're a different, you're Simon Ruffell 2.01, and the day after it might be 2.3 because you've had a really big growth there.
Missed out 2.20.
Yeah, and then the day after that it might be 2.24, because you've not had as much of a growth stage. Does that make sense in terms of the experience? And with
totally.
Big life event changes, death of things, people, parents, kids, brothers, sisters, they are all big life changing events. Your first shag, whatever, these big things. They are, big life changing events, right?
Went up to Simon 5.0 that night.
Yeah. But I mean, people always remember these big things, right? And these kind of experiences, like psychedelics, also have this life changing perspective change. But it's so funny that most people, everyone who takes them, all says the same thing. It was so life-changing, you'll never go back. I can't believe I ever thought in that particular way. And you talked about politics earlier, because it's just come to my mind. What did you mean by that? Is that the story about the political side that was banned because of the hippies or voting or something like that?
Yeah, totally. I'll come to that in a sec. Just one thing I want to pick up on is, you're right. Many people do say, when you take psychedelics, it's like a life-changing experience. And for a lot of people, that is true. But that's also causing massive issues at the moment in psychedelic research and just people who are engaging with psychedelics in general. Because now, mainly thanks to the media, everybody has this expectation that when you take a psychedelic, it's going to completely transform your life. And if it doesn't, then people think, oh my goodness, like, what did I do wrong? Like, even that magic bullet cure couldn't save me because I'm so, I'm so messed up. And this is one thing, it's actually in research, it's been dubbed the Michael Pollan effect. So I'm sure you know. So Michael Pollan is an author, and he wrote this book, How to Change Your Mind, which is this like super popular book about psychedelics. And not almost everyone, but there was a wave a few years ago of people coming into research. When you would screen them, you say like, so, how come you're here? And they say, oh, my wife bought me How to Change Your Mind for Christmas. And just like everyone was reading this book. And so they all had these expectations that it was going to completely transform them. And so that isn't always the case. Or maybe it is changing you, but just not in this way that the media describes, where you kind of really vividly get skyrocketed back to all of these traumatic events in your childhood. You work through them, and then, you have 20 years of therapy in one ceremony. That's what everyone always says, 20 years of therapy in like one dosing. So that's one thing that I just want to pick up on with that, that expectancy.
That's interesting, though.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, just to touch on that before you go on to
yeah, please go for it.
Is expectation such a big thing, isn't it? That if you over expect something, people will say in business as well, under promise, over deliver. It's very much like that. If you've got in your head that, oh my god, I'm going to take these, I'm going to do the ayahuasca, I'm going to do, penis envy mushrooms or whatever, and I'm going to come away having seen, the matrix, basically, the green, and I think that's a really important point that I didn't really think about before. Is that sometimes people overselling stuff essentially actually then diminishes the experience someone has, because they've built it up so much in their head that they can't appreciate it and let go and allow the experience to happen. They're sort of waiting for something. It's like, when you watch a film or listen to music and people say it's a really good song or really good film, you're sort of waiting, oh, what's this really awesome bit that people are talking about?
Yeah, totally. What are penis envy mushrooms?
I think it's just a strain. Like you
It's
get
a strain.
McKenna, obviously Terence McKenna, he's got like McKenna mushrooms, then there's like golden teachers. Blah, blah,
Right,
blah.
okay.
I think penis
I've
envy
n-
like quite one of the stronger ones, I believe.
I've never heard of penis envy mushrooms. Yeah, all right. I have to check that out. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's an interesting one because you I do feel that you need to believe that it's going to work. Everything that you engage in, you've got to believe that it's going to work. And so it's like with therapy. If you go into therapy and you have the attitude of this isn't going to do anything, like this isn't going to help me, like the chance of it actually helping you is so slim, because you're almost like not ready to receive that help. And the same with with taking psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy. Like you have to want it to help you. You have to have that desire, and you could even call it that expectancy that it is going to help you. But it's just kind of keeping that in check. And also, people quite often they're expecting a certain kind of thing. They're expecting kind of the visuals. They're expecting the fireworks show. And it's interesting because visuals are an important part of the psychedelic experience. But in traditional cultures and indigenous cultures, they quite often describe ayahuasca, for example, as a somatic medicine. You feel it in your body. And they actually say that those visuals, they can be distracting. They can kind of get in the way of the experience. So just to bear that in mind as well.
That's quite interesting as well. And just what you said just before that was actually the inverse of what you said earlier. It's like the placebo effect as well. If you want the expectation of it, but then could that be the opposite of like what you said earlier in terms of an underwhelming experience relative to what you'd built it up as, versus a placebo that you're like expecting all this to happen, and it happens because you're expecting it. It's like it's the dichotomy of life, isn't it? I suppose. Are you there, buddy?
Yeah. Sorry, I think it just cut out a bit, but I'm back again. Do you want to say that last bit again?
I was just saying that on the flip side of what we were talking about earlier, it could also be like the placebo, that you're expecting this certain thing to happen, and it happens more because of the expectancy, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting as well. So the curandero, the shaman that I work with, primarily in the Amazon rainforest, when I've been asking him, what's the most important thing when it comes to healing? He always says is your faith in me. It's the participants' faith in me. Your faith that this is going to work no matter what. And it's not. I think that is different from placebo, because it's easy to slip into thinking, okay, well, that's just placebo, and shamans have been called, the masters of placebo, because they can orchestrate this ceremony, they can orchestrate this situation where you're going to fully believe that this is going to change you and this is going to help you, and they're creating that. But I think it is different, because I think there are massive issues with the word placebo, because our connotations of placebo is it means not real, right? It suddenly means it's false. And that really diminishes what the placebo effect is, because the placebo effect is arguably one of the best treatments we possibly have. It's incredibly effective across the board for pretty much every condition. It's free. You can do it yourself. Like if we reframed that as consciousness healing or something like that, and we utilize that, we started utilizing the placebo effect, which some people are beginning to do now, rather than trying to kind of get rid of it and to show a benefit above and beyond placebo effect. I think that actually that would be a far wiser thing to do. And so when Don Rono, who's the curandero I work with, when he says, it's the participants' faith in me that's the most important thing, I do think that's something to be utilized. You have to know that you are going to cure yourself. You are going to get cured through this process. And it might not be that, the cure is the end of the journey, but you have to believe that that is going to happen. And I think that is super important. And it's something that's has to be kept in balance because you can't have unrealistic expectations, but you need to also have that drive. And I think there is a subtle difference between the two.
So, talking about experience, placebo or not, what was your first experience like? I know you talked a little bit about it earlier that it was, like the rose tinted glasses, as it were. But
Mm.
what was the sort of experience like from start to finish? Was there a build up for you? How long was the experience? Was there sort of a time paradox where it was 8 hours worth, but it felt like 10 minutes? What was your sort of
Mm.
experience of it?
So, I mean, the very first time that I took ayahuasca, I mean, it wasn't completely like earth shattering and life changing. I've drank ayahuasca like, many, many, many times. But the very first time, it was, yeah, I mean, like it was awesome. It was amazing. I remember seeing two versions of myself. I was shown a version of myself where I had, undergone all the traumas that I've undergone in my life, basically myself as I was at the time. And then I was shown another version of myself, which was me if I wasn't impacted by all of those traumas in a negative way, and who I could be if that wasn't impacting me. And it was almost like something to aim for. Like I was working through that stuff, which was amazing, which was super, super cool. But it didn't change my perspective on life. Like it didn't change my life view. I mean, arguably it did change my life because after that retreat, this is 2015, I started researching ayahuasca and then I did a PhD into ayahuasca and it became like my whole career and I devoted my life to it. So in that way, like it very much did. But that change in worldview, like that didn't come for another 4 years and another 100 ayahuasca ceremonies down. It happened after a while. So it doesn't always necessarily happen that you have that massive shift. And I've also noticed that a lot of people, especially when taking ayahuasca, not just psychedelics, I've noticed that their partners quite often will raise concerns like, oh, what happens if they're not the same when they come back again? What happens if it completely changes them? And it's interesting because people do change or can change after these experiences. But like in my experience of working with ayahuasca, and this especially in the research that we've been doing, um, people do change, but they seem to almost, like my very first ayahuasca experience, they seem to kind of go back to who they naturally are at their essence, rather than becoming someone else. And my my experience of it is feeling like more myself than I ever have, rather than transforming into someone else.
That's so interesting, especially what you said at the start, where you could see a version of yourself with all of the quote unquote flaws or traumas that have happened,
Hmm.
and then you saw a version without all of that. And it
Hmm.
reminds me of the funeral speech thought experiment, which is basically imagine you're at a funeral and you look up at the front and it's a picture of you, and you hear people speaking, saying, "Oh, he was a good guy," blah blah blah. I think he did this, blah blah blah, and then that's the current speech. Now imagine another speech of what you would want versus what that would actually look like based on your life, and it
Mm.
reminds me very much of that. And that's such an interesting thing, kind of like you said, the ego death earlier. But it's like maybe trying to show you the death of your current self to allow you to become, as you said, the more original essence of yourself without these chinks in the armor, as it were.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, totally. That's very much the way that I've experienced it, and that's the way that I've seen it manifest in people that I've been working with. And yeah, our most recent studies, we're looking at military veterans with PTSD, and they're being taken to the Amazon rainforest, so where we're doing our research, and then they drink ayahuasca, over 2 weeks, usually about 6 ceremonies. And we investigate them in terms of the levels of their PTSD, changes in their brain using neuroimaging techniques such as EEG, which looks at electricity in their brain, changes in their cognition, also looking at their gut microbiome, and then also something called epigenetic changes, which is the way in which their DNA changes its expression as a result of drinking ayahuasca, which is fascinating. All of that stuff is absolutely fascinating. And one thing I've noticed is that many of the military veterans, they go in there with all these kind of traumas, and they expect the things that will come up in their ayahuasca ceremonies to be surrounding war and surrounding, you know, horrible things they've seen or they've done, or, you know, all those kinds of things. And in reality, actually, a lot of the stuff, probably like 80% of the stuff, is usually to do with their childhood, usually to do with some kind of trauma with their dads, you know, kind of around, yeah, below the age of 4 is normally the main kind of stuff that comes up, which kind of makes sense. And when they've worked through those things, or when they're working through those things, it's super interesting to see that change because they don't change who they are in their essence. They don't change their character. They just find that they almost come more into balance to who they were when they were a kid and who they could grow up and they could develop into without being impacted by that trauma. And that usually means that they still have, you know, their humor, they still have their quirks, you know, but they don't necessarily have the things that were less helpful. So, for example, untamable aggression, you know, that normally gets kind of softened a little bit on the edges. But yeah, I've never heard anyone say, "Oh, it completely transformed who I was in a way that I didn't like." You know, it's always, you know, I came back to who I really feel like I am deep down.
Yeah, 100%. I think it can only change the expression of who you are. Like, it couldn't be that, you're 5'2" and you suddenly, you take ayahuasca and you're 7 foot tall. There's only
I've never seen that. No.
yeah, there's only certain software changes that could probably occur, and you are a particular way. It can't. I don't think there's anything that you could just take and it will change you from being extroverted to introverted, or super funny to like a bore. There's not really anything that could do that. It's more about the refinement side. But I've always heard that ayahuasca is kind of like DMT on steroids. Do you think there's some truth in that?
I mean, I think there obviously are similarities between the two because DMT is one of the main active compounds in ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is made from usually two different plants. So you actually only need to have the ayahuasca vine for it technically to be ayahuasca. But the ayahuasca vine contains something called monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the Harmala alkaloids. And these things actually prevent the breakdown of DMT in the gut. And so you have to mix the ayahuasca vine with a DMT containing plant. Now, loads of plants contain DMT, but the most common one that it's mixed with in the Amazon rainforest is a plant called chacruna. And when you mix the two together, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors prevent the breakdown of DMT, and then the DMT gets absorbed into your system, and that's the main way that ayahuasca works. But there are other ways of thinking about how it works as well. Sorry, man, I completely forgotten the question as to what you said just then.
DMT on steroids, I think it was.
That was it. DMT on steroids. Yeah, and so when you're taking DMT, when you're just smoking it, like crystal DMT, it's usually not in a ceremonial context. Like it might be, but quite often it's not. And so when you do take that, you're quite often just blasting off without any guidance and entering this different and complex DMT world. With ayahuasca, it's because of the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, it lasts a lot longer. So DMT, if you smoke it, because it's inhaled, you usually come up within a few seconds, and then you come down after about 15 minutes, and that's normal when you inhale something, because the blood supply is really, really good in your lungs. With ayahuasca, because of the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you stay in the experience for about 6 hours, which is the same with psilocybin mushrooms as well. Now, the main difference is that you have guidance there. Like if you're doing it in a ceremony, if you're working with a shaman, you're guided by a shaman who can navigate through and help you navigate through this world. So again, this is beginning to dip into a different paradigm. But when we think about it in terms of the indigenous paradigm, the shaman is helping you to receive healing from the spirits that the shaman is working with. And so you have that kind of guidance. Now, When I've shown DMT to the shamans that I work with in the Amazon rainforest, they haven't taken it, but they've looked at it in ceremony when they've been under the influence of ayahuasca. And interestingly, when they've felt into the energy of that DMT, they've said there's too much energy in that for too small a thing, which is interesting because you suddenly have this blast off in 15 minutes. And subjectively, the accounts, like, and definitely when I've tried both of them with DMT, it's quite often like, what the hell was that? There was so much information there. A lot of people get benefit from DMT for sure. But when you take ayahuasca, it's much easier to actually become acclimatized to the ayahuasca world. And for me, it can, it can be far more beneficial because you can actually address things, you can think about things, you can work through things, rather than just being taken on a super fast roller coaster for 10 minutes or so.
100%. I think that's one of the things that intrigues me about ayahuasca versus DMT, because of, as you said, the length of the experience, especially because of the type of drug it is. Essentially, that the time there is going to allow for a lot more to happen. Then imagine your favourite pub, right, or bar. You've heard about this awesome pub, and you're allowed to go in, but you have to have a shot of whatever, whiskey, sambuca, vodka, and then you've got to go out. Versus even having like 3 pints, but a pint an hour is going to be a much better experience. And actually, let's just change the first example. Imagine it's an absinthe that 100% absinthe or 90% absinthe gets you absolutely buzzing. But the experience is too short in that awesome bar that you wanted to be in. Having the pints slowly go through your system is going to allow you to experience that place and absorb the place in a much more detail that's going to have more of a benefit for you.
Yeah, that's definitely one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it can be like with DMT, you're basically just like shotting the sambuca or whatever it is, just like by yourself in a dark room somewhere. But when you're like completely unguided and then you're just kind of drunk and not knowing what you're doing, and when you're in the bar and you're drinking, a nice beer over a period of 6 hours, you have a therapist with you who's actively engaging with you to help you to work through any trauma that you have. You know what I mean? So there's a real difference there with the guidance. But that's not just drinking ayahuasca. That's when you have the whole package. That's when you have traditional healers. That's when you have ceremony. That's when you have shamanism. And so for me, you can't even really compare the two, although obviously, the active component, DMT, is present in both. But actually, they're extremely different experiences, and the subjective experience is also very different for people when you compare the two.
So you're saying that taking ayahuasca is not just about the ayahuasca itself; it's about the experience with the shaman who understands, what they're doing. It's like trying to, fix your own car. A mechanic's seen that 1,000 times and knows it's that piston or whatever it's going to be. It needs an oil filter change. He knows instantly. Whereas you, although you could maybe navigate a car with some assistance, it might take a lot longer and you're a lot less efficient at it.
That's an excellent analogy. Yeah, that's an excellent analogy. It's just like that. Why would you, if you don't have experience fixing a car, suddenly try and fix your car? Like, it's almost definitely going to go wrong, and you may well, get in some trouble. Absolutely best case scenario, you'll end up just kind of like opening the bonnet and then putting it down again, which is kind of like DMT in my experience. You kind of just like open up to this world, like the DMT world, and then you're just there, and it's incredibly amazing. And then you just kind of close the bonnet again, and you can come back down again. But with ayahuasca, you're opening up the bonnet, but you're with a mechanic who's been working with cars for, 100 years or something like that. And they can help you to navigate that experience.
Is that where you think maybe bad trips, quote unquote, come from? Is that you're ill-equipped to deal with the potency of the situation or that you're in, or the drug that you've consumed, essentially?
It definitely can be. So I'm always really cautious of this term, like bad trip. When I've worked on clinical trials in hospitals, and I've done that for the last 10 years, that's one thing that people quite often, and in the jungle actually with ayahuasca, people will quite often say, I'm just really scared that I'm going to have a bad trip. I don't really kind of see trips as good or bad. I don't really see the notion of bad trip as particularly helpful. And that's largely because people can have challenging trips for sure. When you go into a setting to work through your trauma, it will almost definitely be challenging. But surely that's a good thing, right? Like you want to, if you're taking psychedelics for a therapeutic purpose, you want to go into an experience that brings your trauma to the surface and you work through it so that when you come out of that experience, you've gone a long way in kind of moving forward in processing that trauma. And so I don't see that as like a bad trip, but it may well be challenging. The there are situations though where people can just have, a really difficult and upsetting time and it's not therapeutic. And a lot of this comes down to what we call set and setting in psychedelic research. So the set is the mindset of the person. That's the way that, that they're feeling, that's the preparation that they've done, that's their headspace. And then the setting is pretty much everything else. So the setting is, what you ate last night, where you are, are you in a hospital or are you in a festival? If you're in a hospital, who's in the room with you? If you're out and about, on the street, are you with people? Are you in nature? All of these kind of things. Did you eat a curry last night? And is that kind of inflaming like your insides? All of these things like that, that's all setting. And if you are in a bad set and or bad setting, then that's almost definitely going to make it challenging, but not necessarily therapeutic. So, for example, if you ate a massive Vindaloo the night before, and then you took a huge dose of LSD and went to Glastonbury Music Festival, and then you lost all your friends and it started raining and you fell into a puddle, then you're almost definitely going to have a challenging experience, but it's not going to be therapeutic. Well, I mean, it might be, but there's going to be more of a chance that it might not be therapeutic. So I guess that could be the bad trip that people are talking about, but in general, I would encourage people not to think of it that way.
I think what you're saying as well, sort of as a sort of underlying context or connotation, I suppose, is that the set and setting is kind of fixed, especially in the ayahuasca sense, if you have a shaman, because they've already got the setting sorted. You're doing this ritual, and then you're in the forest, or whatever it may be, and set wise, the shaman has done this so many times. He can help to manage your mindset in a way. It's very much like having a football coach or a martial arts coach or a teacher or a manager. Sometimes you've had a bad day or you're going through a bad time. You've had a loss or whatever it may be, and they're there to help bring your mind frame back to a position that puts you in a more competitive or the more competitive edge, let's say, in the form of competition. And it was very much like, if there is a shaman there, set and setting is sort of sorted in the way that maybe a bad trip, if that is something people believe in or that can happen, is much less likely to happen than maybe you taking ayahuasca at your own house, having eaten a full English only half an hour before, and you've got friends and family coming in and out that's just going to ruin that whole experience for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would hope so, as long as you have a good shaman and a good ceremony. But then this is another issue as well: is in shamanism, in taking ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest, there isn't. It can be very difficult to know, who is quote unquote a real curandero, who is qualified as such to do that, who's going to run a good ceremony. And it should be the case that if you go to a traditional healer and you want to take ayahuasca or another psychedelic, so for example iboga, that you go and that the setting is going to be held with the utmost integrity, and that all you need to do is to work on your mindset and to get into that space, and then all of that is going to be sorted, as you say. The reality of the situation is it's not like that. If you go to the Amazon rainforest, or even if you stay here in the UK and you try to drink ayahuasca with people, there's a whole host of people because it's completely unregulated. And you could end up with someone who really knows what they're doing, or you could end up with, some sketchy guy who lives in Newcastle in a tracksuit who, just picked up some ayahuasca on the dark web, and says that they're a shaman. And so it's complex. It's difficult.
So what makes a good shaman then? What's the sort of practices? You know, let's say you've now got to this retreat or whatever it may be. How does that start? You know, is it, do they speak to you first? And then you've now taken the drink. What do they do in order to make your experience much more fulfilling?
Mm. Well, there's a huge variety in shamanism. Shamanism as a term is completely flawed. Like it's not an accurate term. It originally actually just relates to traditional healers from Siberia, but that's the term that most people use. And there's a huge variety in the way that you can train in shamanism. But in general, and again, it's not like Western medicine where you get a degree and then you do core training and high training, you become a consultant, and so you know how good people are going to be roughly. It's not like that at all. But the amount of time that you spend is roughly equivalent. So you would expect a good curandero, a shaman, to have done a minimum of about 5 years training, a 5 year apprenticeship, before they would start holding ceremonies. Like that's generally the case. And then it would be kind of like another 10 years. Then they'd be kind of junior. Then it'd be kind of roughly like another 10 years until you become almost kind of like senior, which again is kind of the same as Western medicine. So you're looking at about 15 years until you're the equivalent of a consultant, you know? So that would be like, yeah, like a curandero that other curanderos would start to train with. But again, there's no way of knowing that. There's no way of, asking to see their qualifications. Many ways that people do find that out is through word of mouth. So in the jungle, there is regulation in the Amazon rainforest, but it's largely from people saying, "Hey, yeah, go to this guy. He's great. Don't go to that person. Like, they're super bad and they're involved in really bad stuff." And that's the kind of regulation. But I mean, ultimately, the only way to do it is to go there yourself and to know. So that's why it can get so complex. And there's a huge number of people as well in the Amazon rainforest, and it's understandable because of the poverty there, not excusable, but understandable, who realize that Western people, they don't know the difference. Like all they think is that a good shaman just makes you trip. So they just find plants in the Amazon rainforest that make you trip, and some of them can be quite toxic, some of them can cause psychosis, and they just give them to people and charge huge amounts of money. So you've really got to watch out for that.
So what is it? So first of all, is sometimes though, I suppose word of mouth can be its own review, can't it? Or don't buy your car from this place, or that's a really great pub. People generally do have a pretty good opinion of what's good and what's not good. I suppose for the same reason that when you're going out for a restaurant, you go onto TripAdvisor or on reviews and check, what's the food like, how's the service and stuff. So I suppose that to an extent, without looking at qualifications, can be maybe a good start, I suppose. But one of the things that's interesting is the East versus West, and something that I know that you're quite involved in with regards to research, etc., etc. What do you think the big difference is from an Eastern and Western standpoint with regards to psychedelics, and what do you think would help minimize that gap, and maybe what should be the way forward, if that makes sense?
hmm Yeah, I don't think it's East versus West. I think it's more traditional medicine versus Western medicine. And what's different about the two? I mean, there are so many differences. It's hard to fully pinpoint, what those differences are. I personally think that one of the main differences is the emphasis on spirituality. So in a Western perspective, in Western medicine, we largely focus on the biopsychosocial model. So that was looking at the physiological effects, the biological effects, the psychological effects. So that's kind of obviously like your mentality and mental health, and then social, so your community as well. In indigenous knowledge systems, they focus on the biopsychosocial, spiritual quite often. And so there's this, and again, this isn't across the board, this is generalization, but there's this whole aspect that is left out of Western medicine. And Western medicine sometimes does kind of touch on it, but not in the same way that indigenous medicine does. Indigenous medicine is engaging with concepts like spirits and entities. And shamans quite literally describe themselves as being these middlemen. The role of the shaman isn't to heal you directly. The role of the shaman is to make contact with spirits and entities in the spirit world and to ask them to heal the participant, the patient, on their behalf. And Western science obviously just thinks that's complete nonsense, just doesn't engage with that at all. But pretty much the rest of the world has been saying that that is the case for millennia. And so there's this clash between the paradigms, between different ways of understanding. And this isn't to place indigenous knowledge on a pedestal above Western science. There are many things that Western medicine does perfectly, does really, really well. And, I do not want to diminish that at all. But Western science is completely ignoring a huge part of what indigenous practitioners are saying. In fact, that's the way that they say that they treat mental health conditions, and they work with psychedelics and lots of other conditions as well. So I think it's really important as Western scientists that we're engaging, we're listening to indigenous healers about this.
I think that's a really important point as well, is that from a perspective of saying you don't agree with something, it doesn't mean that you don't agree with everything that person says or everything that theory stands for. It's just that you're saying this one point, because that's what a lot of people do, isn't it? You say, oh, Western medicine, like, but what about, when you broke your leg, you went to the hospital. It's like, well, you're not necessarily saying that. It's like a fallacy in itself. Is that you're saying maybe certain parts of this could be adopted here, maybe certain parts of this could be adopted back here, and
totally
maybe having a coherence between them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I really think that the way that we move forward in terms of science and healthcare and probably many other things in humanity is to start listening to each other and to move forward together. And what that requires is respectful listening. It doesn't require us to suddenly, believe in everything that indigenous practitioners are saying. Like, absolutely not. But it does require us to take what they're saying seriously, and to not place Western science on a pedestal, and give it power to either validate or not to validate what indigenous peoples are saying. It requires that open dialogue and that open communication.
Talking about openness, let's come back to the political side. And what are the reasons why psychedelics were banned, essentially, and seen as harmful, even though there's a lot of evidence now that to the contrary, essentially?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the general thought right now is that it was largely because of the Vietnam War, and that politicians were seeing that it was mainly LSD during this kind of the hippie movement, were having changes to their political views, and they basically didn't want to go to war. Young men didn't want to go to war, and there are lots of signs from that time, drop acid, not bombs, all of these kinds of things. Yeah, and as a result of that, psychedelics were deemed as being dangerous, and it started this huge campaign, the war on drugs. And we see all of these adverts, which are completely bonkers. Things like there was one kind of newspaper headline which was LSD turned me into a frog or something. I don't even know what that one was about. There were all these like bizarre headlines from that time, from this campaign. And there are these interesting quotes from Kennedy saying, well, I don't understand it. These things were showing so much promise in psychedelic research before this point. Am I missing something? Why do we now think that they're incredibly dangerous? And that's Kennedy kind of showing that confusion as to why this field of research that was thought to be maybe the next frontier in psychiatry is suddenly being blocked. And so now on kind of reviewing all of the literature and realizing that actually the concerns surrounding safety actually largely were fabricated as a result of these political motivations. Now that research is fully up and running again. But what it has done, it's stunted psychiatry to a point compared to the rest of medicine that's actually quite embarrassing. So if you look at every other area, every other specialty in medicine, there's been huge improvements. So cancer research, absolutely fantastic. Psychiatry really hasn't progressed that much in many areas over the last 50 years. We're still using the same medications and the same treatments we were using 50 years ago. And the psychedelics could be that new way forward, or a new way forward. But, we could have done that 50 years ago if we hadn't have banned all the research into it.
Well, maybe that's political as well, in regards to profit rather than big
Hmm.
pharma, rather than something that's naturally abundant and grows essentially. Well, specifically with mushrooms, etc.
Hmm.
And maybe it's part of the fact that, as you said about the Vietnam War, it was dangerous because the elites wanted people to go to war on their behalf, but actually people taking acid were no longer brainwashed by the propaganda to say, please go and die in our wars for our agenda. So I think that's
Hmm.
really shows what the motives of some of these people are. I mean, well, we know that from Epstein, etc. now anyway, I suppose,
Hmm.
but it's crazy to think about.
Mhm. But I think it's also it's interesting because there's another assumption here, right? There's an assumption that taking psychedelics, like in this case LSD, makes you more left wing. Like in a nutshell, that's like what the assumption is, and most people would agree with that assumption. But we're seeing quite an interesting phenomena right now, especially in the United States, where psychedelics are being associated with more right wing things. It's more people on the right that are getting interested in psychedelics, which is an interesting change. And there are also, it's not given that just by taking psychedelics, you're going to become a nicer person, that you're going to become more left wing. I wrote about this in my PhD thesis. There are numerous cases of cults and, all these like horrendous things where there are all these biker gangs in the States who would take huge quantities of LSD and then they would go out and they would like commit murder. So it doesn't, and LSD has been used for brainwashing, and all of these kinds of things as well.
Yeah, was it
So
MK Ultra?
so MK Ultra, yeah, is probably the biggest example of that as well. So it doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean if you take psychedelics that you're going to become more left wing and become more open. I think that's another misconception.
There's so many misconceptions though. It's difficult to understand what is right and what isn't right.
Hmm.
For the majority of people, I know we've got a lot of information online, but it depending on what you search for, I suppose. Because I could type in, is cabbage good for you, and then is
Hmm.
cabbage bad for you, and you can probably find articles for both sides of the argument. And it's
Yeah,
quite
totally.
interesting that we have to filter through everything and make our own assessment to find out what the truth is
Hmm.
behind a lot of this fugazi. Let's say.
Hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. It is confusing. In my opinion, the media is to blame for a lot of it, for creating that confusion. But there we go.
100%, but that's what they're there for. The BBC, the British Brainwashing Corporation, as it's known.
As it's known in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, is there anything that we've not spoken about that you want to sort of touch on with regards to obviously your research, psychedelics, just your experiences in general?
Mm. I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of grounds. I guess I can tell you where to find out more about the work, if that would be
Sounds
helpful.
good. Sounds awesome.
Yeah. Cool. So you can check out all of our research at onaya, ONAYA dot science. You know how to spell science. And then you can also look at onaya.io on Instagram to keep up to date with all of our developments and everything that we're doing. And then my own personal website is Dr. Simon Ruffell, RUFF Freddie ELL.com. So yeah, please feel free to reach out if you want to continue the conversation.
Awesome. And what kind of research are you doing at the moment? Because obviously with research, you go down different sort of paths to do research on this thing. And so, what's your current,
Mhm.
or can you not talk about it at this point?
No, I totally can. Yeah, so our research is looking at military veterans with PTSD, and those military veterans have either like what's regarded treatment resistant or difficult to treat PTSD. So they've tried many different things, and it hasn't helped. And they go to the Amazon rainforest and they drink ayahuasca, and then we look at the changes that they experience over that retreat. And so what we do is we look at their changes in PTSD, their PTSD scores. We look at associated things like anxiety and depression. We look at changes in their cognition. We look at how that impacts their brains. So we look at using So we use EEG before and after the ceremonies to see how it's impacting them neurologically. And then we also look at their gut microbiome, and we look at the way that ayahuasca changes the expression of their DNA as well, which is this field called epigenetics. And we look at the whole of their genome, so it's genome-wide studies, which is super, super interesting. And the results that we've got so far have been really impressive, actually. So we found that over 80% of our participants no longer meet our criteria for PTSD, not only after their retreats, but at 6-month follow-up. And that's incredible. That's a really, really incredible result. It's actually much higher than any other treatment for PTSD, including MDMA. But obviously, this is observational research, and it hasn't been published yet, hasn't been peer reviewed yet. It will be, but we're 3 years into a 5-year study, so we'll keep you posted on all of that. But yeah, that's what we're up to at the moment.
That's awesome. What would you expect from, let's say, someone who was not from a military background with questionable PTSD? Would you expect similar results, like along the 80%, or would that differ? Or are you not sure?
I mean, if it was questionable PTSD, then I would suggest that we should look at something else. That we should look at whatever it is that the condition that they have that we think that they should be treating. But if it was a neurotic condition, so over the last 11 years, we've been looking at the impact of ayahuasca on personality. We found decreases in neuroticism. We've looked at the impact of ayahuasca on depression, anxiety, self-compassion, and we found that there are improvements in all of those areas. We found that genes that are related to trauma and traumatic memories change their expression, so they actually decrease their regulation. So we're seeing changes as a result of ayahuasca on a genetic level. And the gut microbiome stuff has actually never been done before, so I have to keep you posted on the findings that we get there. So it really depends on the profile of this person as to what it is that we'd expect to see with their changes.
That's quite interesting, though, with the gut stuff, because they say that the gut is the second brain, don't they? The stomach's the second brain.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, and it's fascinating. I can't believe it hasn't been looked at with any psychedelics yet, but yeah, pleased to be doing it.
Well, groundbreaking stuff then.
Thanks, man.
Well, thanks for being on the show, mate. It's been an awesome chat, and yeah, I've learned a lot, which is awesome. And as you said, if anyone wants to reach out to you, they've got your personal email address, a couple of websites as well. And yeah, thanks again.
Pleasure, Jeevan. And yeah, speak to you soon.